Enoch. If you go over to Genesis chapter 5 is where we'll start. Enoch was one of the ones whenever he mentioned the topic and mentioned who I was going to be speaking on. Enoch was the one I had to scratch my head on for a few moments and think, how much material is there? Ironically, this is the one that I almost had a handout because it was going to be too much information to put onto the PowerPoint. Ended up I decided not to do that. I decided to whittle it down to a little bit less material. There is so much we could talk about when it comes to the example that Enoch gives. What we have here in Genesis chapter 5, starting there in verse 21, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he had fathered Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters, and thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And that is what we have about Enoch. And from that, we're going to be talking about quite a bit. We're going to jump over real quick to Hebrews chapter 11. And this is where the other passage that we have for him, the one that Jeremy had said, this is what I would like you to speak on. And I said, okay, before I realized what I said okay to. And we have almost a parallel passage, almost a copy or a paraphrase of that original text, starting here in verse 5. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found, because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever who would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. If you look there in verse 5, he was commended as pleasing God. We don't know much about him. We don't know what he did that pleased God other than he did it by faith. We aren't told all the things that he did. We're not told about his family that he had. We're told about a little bit of his genealogy. But if you notice here in verse 6, sometimes whenever we go to Hebrews chapter 11 to make a point, we read verses 1, 2, and 3. Then we jump down to verse 6, and then we kind of move on to other passages. But verse 6 is directly tied to verse 5. Enoch, even though there's not much said about him and not a whole lot of story about Enoch himself, we see that he was taken so that he should not see death, and he was commended as pleasing God. And the next verse, in verse 6, is the verse that we know very well. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. The same word described both in verse 5 and verse 6. And then he mentions two things that Enoch did, and that we, by example, should also do. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. And that's what we're going to be working with this morning, is the idea of believing that God exists, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. And we're going to be dealing with some evidences this morning. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. What I'm trying to do, what I hope to do, is as we go through some of these things, some of the evidences that are there, these are introductions for you to continue your study. As we introduce a couple things, I'm going to bring up a couple minor points in an overall library of things we could look at evidence-wise in that subcategory. And we'll move on to the next category. So we consider these evidences, and that's only going to be a few of them. And the more that we read, and the more that we study, and the more we look into evidences, the more we're going to find. And so what we're going to be dealing with this afternoon, because I can't go to midnight apparently, is just a few of them. And I want to at least pique your interest. I want you to at least think of, well, maybe I never considered that evidence, or maybe I haven't looked into that far enough. And if you'd like to, take that idea and run with it. Faith and evidence. We are often told that we as Christians have blind faith. What is blind faith? We are told that we have faith despite evidence to the contrary. We are told that we have faith just because we want to have faith and that there's no reason for us to have faith. The problem is I don't know anybody who has ever done anything on blind faith. Faith is always based on some type of evidence. Whether it's the faith in the one who's speaking, if you have belief in someone who tells you, if I trust you and you tell me it and I run with that, I may be in error, but my faith is based on my trust in you. Or sometimes it's faith in the evidences that are presented. whether their evidences are faulty or not. And whenever we talk about evolution, we cannot get around the idea that they too have faith. And oftentimes it's faith on the one who is speaking to them, whether it be their professor or other individuals. And sometimes it's the evidence. And that's not to say that the evidence is always correct, that they are basing their faith on. Whether we believe in creation or we believe in evolution, both of them are based on faith. And the question is, which evidences are better? So just as like I said, these are only a few minor things, and as you want to, you can take these ideas and run with them and look for more evidence. But consider DNA. All that coded information that makes you unique. Whenever the police go to a crime scene and they find any piece of hair or skin or blood, they run a DNA test to figure out who it is because it is unique to you. DNA is microscopic. You cannot see it. Whenever Darwin wrote his book, he wrote about what was inside the cell. He didn't know what it was. They couldn't see it back then. Michael Behe, a scientist later on, called it Darwin's black box. Because Darwin had the theory that inside that cell was nothing of any great significance. It was going to be simple and easy to be understood. Well, as microscopes increased and people could see further into the cell, they realized it was anything but simple. And out of that, all kinds of information pours. DNA is the substance that makes our bodies what they are. And inside of our DNA is inside of each cell is a 6 foot long strand of DNA. And if you were going to turn that into simple binary, just ones and zeros, our one strand of DNA would take up 1.5 gigs of data. To put that into terms, about 2 CDs worth, or about half of a DVD. And at the onset, doesn't sound like a whole lot of information, but that is a lot of information. If you were to consider all the information that our bodies contain, taking all the DNA in our bodies, it is that number down there, which I'm not even going to try to figure out exactly what that is. 150 with all those zeros of gigabytes of data in our bodies. Harvard set a world record recently for putting 700,000 gigabytes of data into 1 gram of DNA. When we talk about when it comes to processing and how much information we can store, there is nothing better in this entire world than our DNA. There is nothing that holds information better than us. And Harvard proved that by jamming packed 170,000 gigs. I'm not sure what the computer is, but I can guarantee you it's nowhere near that when it comes to hard drive space. And that is a huge hard drive. And we're talking about 8 gram of DNA. We went up to Quebec. I know this is a pretty dim picture. I apologize for that. We went up to Quebec last year. And at the top of the waterfall, there's a bridge that goes over the waterfall. And looking down, you can see at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, there's all of these logs that have fallen down the river upstream, have washed out, and have fallen over and landed on the side of the waterfall. And looking down over there, I realized that there's something unique about those logs. If you look pretty much right in the middle, I think you said this is the pointer. Right here it says drama, Mexico, P+T. You have Yoshi, missing part of the O there. Vale. I don't know anybody who's ever looked at that and said, huh, look at all those words that Mother Nature spelled out for us. There's a much simpler explanation, and that is somebody came down and did it. In fact, just off the picture on this side, there was a group of people down there who were doing just that the day that we were there. And there's if you were to pan over, there's a whole stairway that walks down. This is simple stuff. It is spelling out simple English words. And nobody ever says, oh, look at those words, look what Mother Nature did. Nobody does that. Everyone says, oh, someone must have been down there and wrote that. And yet we have enough information in our bodies to fill hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of computers. And yet people say, oh, consider that it came about by natural circumstance. Consider the odds of putting together the simplest of cells, having all the pieces come together by random chance. The odds of that are less than 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Whenever I was writing this out, I started to type all the zeros, and I realized that 40,000 was going to be just a bit too many to put on one slide. That is a 1 with 40,000 zeros behind it. The odds of a simple cell coming about by random chance. That is more than there are stars in heaven. To give you an idea just what the probability is. There is a point in statistics where they say is a statistical impossibility. Well, yes, the odds are there, we can calculate them, but given the time frame of our universe, the odds of that happening in the time frame that our universe exists, it's impossible. That number meets that impossibility. And yet what the scientific community would love us to believe is that the theory of large numbers, that given enough time and enough space, enough distance, anything is possible. And that simply isn't the case. The odds against it are so astronomical that the word astronomical isn't big enough to describe the odds against it. Consider the evidence of the spark of life. One biologist put it this way: if you were to take a simple cell and just cut open the membrane that holds everything together and let all the parts spill out, and then you, as an intelligent person, to put it all back in and kind of seal up the membrane, nobody would ever suppose that they could make that cell live again. The Bible describes that. In Genesis chapter 2, and God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and he became a living being. There is nothing to describe how we came to live besides what the Bible offers. And like I said, these are just small portions of these evidences that I'm encouraging you guys. If you have questions or doubts or fears, then look at it. Look at the evidence. As I said last night, if we feel that we are losing our faith, go and find it. Consider the evidence of the mind. And obviously I didn't go into great details because we have a lot to go through. Where did consciousness come from? How does that happen? We understand that each night we kind of go into a form of unconsciousness when we go to sleep, and we understand waking up, but we don't know how that happens. And anesthesiologists go to school for years and years to figure out how to put you to sleep before surgery and how to wake you up afterwards, but they don't know why that happens. They just know how to trigger it. What about being self-aware? Viewing ourselves as being a separate entity. That I have thoughts and feelings that are unique to myself, and I know that I'm alive and exist. The old philosophy of I think, therefore I am. Where does that idea of being self-aware come from? It doesn't seem to happen to anybody else but us as humans. And yet there's nothing to describe how that happens. The same thing for morality. What is it that makes morality in this world? And we all agree on morality. If I come out and I steal your car today after our meeting, everyone would agree that would be a wrong thing to do. Well, I want it more than you want it. That isn't a good enough excuse. And whether we're atheists or any other religion, everyone agrees that me stealing your car is a wrong thing to do. Where does morality come from? That is a huge bit of evidence for us. And like I said, these are just questions for you to explore further if you would like. Carbon dating is one that has been anathema to us for a little while. Carbon dating is based on the simple principle that there is an element in everything on Earth, carbon-14. And there is a certain time period at which it decays, according to scientists. That it decays at a certain rate, and from that rate we can kind of figure out how old something is within a general realm. Well, what happens whenever the scientists say, well, here we have a rock that is 200 million years old, or we have a fossil that dates inside of 150 million years? What do we do with that? It's a hard thing for us as non-scientists, non-paleontologists, paleontologists, there we go, non-geologists to answer. Well, doing some research recently, I found out there is something called the misplaced artifacts. They are artifacts that should not and cannot exist given the current understanding of carbon-14 dating. And yet nobody wants to talk about it. In fact, I had a hard time finding high-resolution photos to put on the PowerPoints because nobody wants to talk about it. It's something that's there and they know about and they want to hide because no one wants you to know about it. There's a 300 million year old screw they found. There are some both animal parts and some plant parts that have the curlicue structure to it. They did testing and made sure, no, it's not any of those, not biological matter, it's metal. And what they found someone was doing a dig site and they found this rock that has most evidently a screw. And they said, oh, it must be a piece of farm machinery locked inside of a really hard piece of dirt, and almost threw it away. And someone said, well, let's take a look at it a little bit closer. And the rock itself dates to 300 million years old. Now, Homo sapiens, what they would classify us as, didn't arrive on, according to them, until 100,000 years ago. If you do the math, I don't know what amoeba was putting screws together, but that's where we're at this point in time. This one is called the London hammer, found not too far outside of London. It is a hammer made out of iron ore that can only be made in that purity given modern smelting techniques. As we're going to see the picture in just a minute, it has a handle that goes through it, and it is encased in stone. That is 100 million years old. Again, the question is, who smelted it, who put it together, and who used it 100 million years ago? And the question has to be asked, isn't there something wrong with carbon-14 dating if this is the answers that they're bringing forward? If you notice here, I stole this off of Steve Rudd's page, Bible.ca. He has a host of these things. Not only just misplaced artifacts, but a bunch of other things. And if you take the time to go to his website, he has a lot of good research material there. This is one of my favorites. And I had found maybe 8 or 9 of these that were pretty good, and I was just going to try to pick out a few of them. This is one of my favorites. It's a 3-pronged plug made of metal, rubber, and plastic that is completely encased in a rock that is dated to 100,000 years ago, which would be right at the time that Homo sapiens supposedly came on the scene. And yet they were making plastic and rubber and putting it into outlet plugs. How that happened, I don't know, but it looks like this, and you can see it clear as day. It's pretty hard to miss. But yet carbon-14 dating has destroyed the faith of a lot of people. They say, well, here we have strong evidence that the world existed long before Genesis says that God created it. And we have evidence that there was animals and plants and people that lived long before the Bible says that existed based on this evidence. And there is a host of things that say, well, let's consider, is carbon-14 dating really that accurate? When it comes to things that we are going to base our faith on, is that what we want to base our faith on? If we were to move forward and move out of the realm of just creation and talk about the evidences we have for Jesus Christ, and like I said, we're not going into huge details because we would be here until midnight if we were even to begin to scratch that surface. But there are more than 4 dozen major predictions of the Messiah made in the Old Testament. There are over 300 predictions made in the Old Testament. Whoever classifies them as major and minor, I'm not exactly sure. More than 4 dozen major ones in the Old Testament. And we have Louis Lapides, who is obviously has a lot of letters behind his name, and I'll let you figure out what all those mean yourself. He said the odds of Jesus fulfilling 8 prophecies, out of that 4 dozen, just 8 of them, is 1 in 100 million billion, which is more than all the people who ever lived on this earth. In fact, it's the same odds if you were to take Tunis, and you were going to cover the entire province of Ontario in Tunis, a foot deep, or I don't know how many centimeters that is, a foot deep, and then you blindfold somebody, not blind them, sorry. If you blindfold someone and send them out across Ontario and tell them to pick up the one toonie that you marked, blindfolded, that is the same odds of Jesus fulfilling just 8 prophecies from the Old Testament. If we were going to go further, since we're talking about the 4 major, but mathematician Peter W. Stone calculated the odds of Jesus fulfilling all of those 4 dozen major ones as 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. The evidences of prophecy and Jesus fulfilling them are fantastic evidences. There is a reason that God, through the Holy Spirit, had placed so many of them in the Old Testament, and has taken the time to detail all of them, again in the New Testament, being fulfilled. All you have to do is just open up to chapter 1 in Matthew and start from there, and you see it. Prophecies that were made hundreds of years before. And like I said, these are our starting points for your own personal research. Look into the evidences for the life of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says that his faith was based on three things: the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. That was the foundation for his faith. And you notice that Paul didn't become a Christian until he saw the resurrected Jesus. Because he realized that was a key element. Look into the evidence of Jesus being a real historical person. About 100 years ago, that was one of the biggest claims against Christianity. Well, Jesus wasn't real. He was a fictional person. You know, after about a couple decades, those arguments ceased. And that isn't something you hear hardly at all anymore, that Jesus wasn't historical, because there's just so much evidence. The same thing goes for the death of Jesus. One of the biggest ones you're going to find over and over again is the swoon theory, that Jesus swooned on the cross and no one realized that he was still alive, and they put him in the tomb, and after 3 days he recovered and he rolled the stone away himself and then pretended to be alive, or pretended to have died and then proved himself to be alive. And there's holes for that theory as well, and they're huge ones. Take the time to look at the evidence for the death of Jesus. And then the resurrection. If Paul says that his faith is based on those three elements, aren't they things that we should research pretty carefully too, to make sure that our faith is based on something solid and important? There's any number of quotes we could put in here. These are ones that I've been told personally within the past 2 years. Modern attempts to discredit our faith as Christians. Evolution is scientifically proven. If you're going to prove something by the scientific method, you have to first repeat it. And as far as I know, there has been no research into repeating evolution. In fact, I have a hard time imagining the scenario where you, without any intelligent design, produce a situation in which natural things could evolve into living things. And the list could go on and on about how it's not observable, it's not repeatable, it is based on faith. And what happens is, in the scientific community, they make the note that it is the theory of evolution. And then once we get into college and university and middle school and high school textbooks, they redefine what a theory is. A theory is not something that is a guess or an idea of how something happened. It is an explanation of how it has happened. And our children and our teenagers and our young adults are raised with the belief that it has been proven. And it has destroyed the faith of so many. One person I was sitting on a plane next to said that he was wanting to, whenever he had kids, he was going to raise them Christian, because he liked the morality system of being a Christian. But he said, be a Christian for the morality, but know that God is not real. I don't even know where to begin with that one. That I love the morality that God has instilled in His gospel, but I don't want to believe that He exists. I want to look at the evidence of an intelligently designed person, and I sense that there is a right and there is a wrong that is external of me and my own thoughts and my own wants, and I'm going to hold to that morality that naturally came about, external to me, but I'm going to teach my children not to believe in a God. Religion is man-made, but spirituality is divine. And I asked this lady, how do you define spirituality? And she said, it's connecting and feeling the universe around you. And this is things that are very, very common in our society. That any form of religion is man-made. By sensing the universe around us, that's divine. In Romans chapter 1, as Paul is dealing with the divide between the Jewish Christians and the Christians that come from the Gentile world, he first in chapter 1 addresses the Gentiles. The Jews had the law and they knew about God. And the Gentiles, they didn't have the law. And he says here in chapter 1 that they were without excuse. And you can imagine the Jewish audience, they're saying, yes, they're right. They didn't have an excuse. And then as soon as they get over to chapter 2 and Paul writes to them and says, well, you had the law and you didn't keep it, you can hear the Gentiles going, yes, you were right. You did keep it as well. But notice what he says here about God in Romans chapter 1, verse 19. Well, let's actually back up into verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Have you ever noticed individuals who are farmers? Individuals who spend their time outdoors? The majority of them most certainly tend to be individuals who are at least spiritual. Individuals who look towards God. And I have a hard time understanding individuals who spend their entire lives out in God's creation day after day and not seeing his handiwork. This is what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 19. If we take the time to look outside of ourselves and look at the world around us, what can be known about God has clearly been shown to us. David in Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and night by night they pour forth knowledge. In our society, we spend a lot of time looking down at books, down at our tablets, down at our phones, and looking down on others. We're allowed to use that colloquialism. When was the last time you took the time to look up recently? If the heavens declare the glory of God, and night by night they pour forth knowledge, when was the last time that you took the time to read the glory of God through the heavens? We don't take the time too often to do that. But if we did, we might have a better understanding of God's eternal power, his eternal nature. He says in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, his invisible attributes have been clearly perceived since the creation of the world. And so we are without excuse. As we go over Acts chapter 17, Paul ingratiates himself with the crowd there at the Areopagus when he is asked to come up and speak to them of this new religion, this new philosophies and these new ideas. And he says that I perceive that in every way you are very religious individuals. And as I walked this way, I noticed there was an altar to the unknown God. And he begins from there to tell about the God that they don't know about. And if you start with me there in verse 24, he says, the God who has made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needs anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries for their dwelling place. Notice here in verse 27 that they should seek God in hopes that they may feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from each one of us. Have you ever considered why God hasn't personally revealed himself to each one of us? Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 makes that point clear. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists. And what Paul says here in Acts chapter 17 is that God wants us to seek him and feel our way towards him and find him. And he also makes the point that he's not far from each one of us. That it's not an impossibility for us to seek God and to find him, to feel our way towards him. Enoch lived in a time period where the world was increasingly more vile. And that's evidence just as you go over to Genesis chapter 5 and just continue on. We have Methuselah, we have a couple more generations, and then we get to chapter 6, and every thought and intent of man was evil continuously. That was the time frame of Enoch. And he was not, for God took him, for he pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. Now, if you do the math there in Genesis chapter 5, you're going to realize that you are not that far removed from somebody being able to know Adam. The one who spoke to God in the garden, in the cool of the evening. The one who saw the garden and it being guarded by the flaming swords. We know this. They're not that far removed, but yet almost nobody at that time period had faith in God. We live in a time frame that is, I don't know if it's too far removed from that. We have the evidence all around us. And yet there are people who throw their hands up and say that there is no God. Our job is to seek God and to feel our way towards him and find him. In Matthew chapter 7 is a passage we had referenced yesterday. The simple passage is, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. I may mention before that our faith is challenged at every turn. You cannot turn on the TV, you cannot open a newspaper, you cannot turn on the radio where evolution and a world without God is constantly pushed on us. And there are so many people who just throw up their hands and say, well, I quit. I don't know. I can't find. I don't know what to do with all this evidence. And they just give up. I don't know if you've noticed. If you look around to the churches, whether it be here in Canada or the northern United States or the southern United States, there's a generation that is missing. There's a generation who has walked away because they have come up against what to them seems like strong evidence against God. And instead of seeking him and finding him and feeling their way towards him, instead of digging down and finding evidences for God, they have thrown up their hands and they've walked away. One person said that the average Christian loses his faith in 9th grade science class. The first time that they're told that God is not real and that the smartest people on the earth have proven it. And if we don't take the time to look for God and to seek him, if we don't knock so the door is open, then we are without excuse. By faith, Enoch pleased God because he believed God existed. In John chapter 14, we start there in verse 1. If we were to read this text in this mindset of seeking God, I want us to read with that mindset. Here in verse 1 of John chapter 14, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Now remember, we're dealing with the two things that he says here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Believe that God exists, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. Both of those things are directly addressed here in verses 1 through 6. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would not have told you, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and I will take you to myself. And where I am, you may be also. And you may know the way, and you know the way of where I'm going. And Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. If you have known me, you have known the Father also. From now on you do know him, and you have seen him. Isn't Jesus telling him there to have faith that he exists, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him? He begins there in verse 1, believe in God, believe also in me. Believe that these things are so. And then comes the reward there in verse 2 and verse 3. In my Father's house there are many rooms, and I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come and take you to where I am. And there's a seeking that goes on here in verse 8. I am the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And you know the way. That's their job that he lays up for them in chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. To believe that he exists, and to believe that he rewards those who diligently seek him. Both of those elements are clearly seen. Enoch pleased God, because he diligently sought him. We believe that he exists. And we too, if we have faith that he exists, and faith that he rewards those who diligently seek him, we will please him. If we were to skip down even into verse 15, and I want to skip this point here in John chapter 14, verse 15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. When he says here earlier on in verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me, that's what he's dealing with here in verse 15. And again over in verse 23. He makes those points that we are to seek him and find him, diligently seek him, that he will reward us for that. That's what we have for Enoch. There in Hebrews chapter 11, he makes the point clear that Enoch pleased God. In fact, if we notice there what he's talking about, that Enoch was taken with God. Isn't that where we want to be? Isn't that where our hope is? I don't know how you feel about the world around us, but it's not my favorite place. It is depressing. This is a personal choice, and I'm not encouraging this by any means on you guys. We don't own a TV. We don't subscribe to any newspapers. And we don't look at any local news. Whenever things happen back in the States about election or anything else, people, for some reason, James seems to know more than I do. And James, have you heard what's happening back in the States? Well, no, I haven't. I really haven't. Because you can't turn on the news or the radio or pretty much anything without seeing murder and rape and greed and theft and lasciviousness and lewdness. It is full of things that are promoted, things that are terrible. This world is not a world that I want to be in for my whole eternity. I want something far better than this. Enoch achieved that through faith, that God existed and that he rewarded those who diligently sought him. That's the promise we have laid for us. We're going to continue on in the next hour to talk about what it means to diligently seek him, what it means to be saved through faith. We'll talk about that in just a few moments.